We go now to Mount Pleasant, South Carolina, and Republican Senator Tim Scott. Good morning to you, Senator.
Good morning, Margaret. I hope you're doing well.
It's great to have you back. I want to get into your proposals, but first ask you about what's happened overnight, where protests are continuing in Atlanta after Rayshard Brooks was shot. The officer who shot him has been fired. The police chief has resigned. Do you agree that this was not an appropriate use of force?
Well, it seems like the mayor says it was an excessive use of force. That's really the question. The question is, when the suspect turned to fire the taser, what should the officer have done? One of the challenges that we have in these split-second decisions is the need for more training. That's why the de-escalation aspect of my bill and the House bill is so critically important, so that we don't revert back to basic fear plus adrenaline leads us to the genetic code, so to speak. That's a hard balance to achieve. So in order for us to provide more opportunities to de-escalate these situations and to reduce the use of force, we have to have effective training. That situation is certainly a far less clear one than the ones that we saw with George Floyd and several other ones around the country.
Well, this is how it was handled on a local level, but you have the responsibility on your shoulders of how to reform things from the federal level down. What do you think needs to be in the bill that you're working on?
Well, there are three major parts of it. We have to have all the information. Today, only 40% of law enforcement departments are actually providing information to the DOJ. We need 100% as it relates to serious bodily injury and death. When the officer uses force, we need to have all the information. I've been working on this, Margaret, for 5 years. The second thing we have to do is look at training and tactics. If we do that, we can certainly de-escalate the situation and make sure that the officer and the suspect go home. And then the third part of it is officer misconduct. If we can drill into officer misconduct, we do it on the local level. House has been talking about doing it on the state level. The president's executive order talks about doing it on a national level.
Officer misconduct, you've been talking about having information sharing when it comes to hiring. But what about the firing? Democrats in particular emphasize that reducing qualified immunity, making it easier to fire bad cops, needs to be in legislation. Are you open to that?
Well, there are two ways that you could deal with that. From the Republican perspective, and the president has sent the signal that qualified immunity is off the table. They see that as a poison pill. On our side, we could use the decertification of officer, except for the law enforcement unions say that's a poison pill. So we're going to have to find a path that helps us reduce misconduct within the officers. But at the same time, we know that any poison pill in legislation means we get nothing done. That sends a wrong signal, perhaps the worst signal right now in America. I think we're going to have legislation that can be negotiated, that gets us to the place where something becomes law that actually makes a difference. That's got to be our goal.
So to be clear, you personally would be open to reducing immunity, but not removing it completely?
No, I think there's a way for us to deal with it. Decertification would be a path that I would be interested in looking at. That is a path that has got a roadblock because I don't have the votes on the other side to make that into law. If we do it right, I think we can reduce the number of times that we're dealing with misconduct on the police departments. If we don't do it right, then we'll have the same situation where there is no law. We can do better than that as a nation, and we will.
We spoke with the Attorney General last Sunday on Face the Nation, and he pointed to a growing number of African-American police chiefs as a sign of progress. And he also said this.
I think there's racism in the United States still, but I don't think that the law enforcement system is systemically racist.
You've talked about your own personal experiences with being targeted, stopped by police, even on Capitol Hill by a police officer who questioned whether you were a senator. Do you agree with the Attorney General that there is not systemic racism in law enforcement?
Well, I will say most of us don't really understand the definition of systemic racism. It changes based on the conversations. What I would suggest is that you look at the racial outcomes. Is there a nexus to race in some of the outcomes in law enforcement? I think the answer is yes. Can we reduce that so that we're no longer battling the question of the definition of systematic or systemic racism? I think the answer is yes. But there's no question that the outcomes seem to have a racial component, and that's why we're working on getting all the information, then retraining, and then eliminating those police officers that have a pattern of misbehavior.
After Charlottesville, you said the president of the United States is not racist, but he is racially insensitive. This past week, he scheduled and then rescheduled by a day his first political rally in 3 months. It was scheduled for June 19th, the celebration of the end of slavery, and located in a city, Tulsa, Oklahoma, that was the site of one of the worst massacres of black people in this country's history. The symbolism alone here seems damaging. Should he just call it off?
He's welcome to go wherever he wants to go. I'm thankful that he moved it. Certainly, the Tulsa, Oklahoma race riots were the worst in American history by account. Next year is the 100th anniversary. The president moving the date by a day once he was informed on what the Juneteenth was, that was a good decision on his part. I think if we look at the president's speech at West Point, we find really what I think is the path forward on how to talk about these really encouraging issues of racial progress and those issues that are discouraging, the racial divide.
It was this school that gave us the men and women who fought and won a bloody war to extinguish the evil of slavery. The Army was at the forefront of ending the terrible injustice of segregation.
If we hear more of that, our nation will turn its head and listen a little closer to what the president says on issues of race. That is the path forward for this nation. It's finding the common ground and those institutions that bring us together. Without that, we may be looking at worse outcomes, not better outcomes, in the next few months.
So just to be clear, you think no one on the Trump campaign or in the Trump White House had any idea of the significance of these two events?
My understanding is he moved the date once he understood the Juneteenth. I'm not sure that the planners on his inner circle team thought about June 19th, Tulsa, Oklahoma, and race riots. Unless you're doing a historical check, you probably don't get those dots connected. But I have always said my staff in Washington is an incredibly diverse staff, and diversity on our staffs help us avoid some of the pitfalls. The president, fortunately, has some folks that used to work with me, Jerron and others, who I think helped to inform and educate the president on why Tulsa, Oklahoma, June 19th was not the best date to do it on it. And to his credit, he moved it. So that's good news.
Senator Scott, thank you for your time this morning.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.